It was supposed to be just another day for James Wilson, a retired Army veteran who had seen it all, done it all, and now was simply trying to live a peaceful life. He was walking home from a local store, minding his own business, when everything changed. What started as an ordinary afternoon would soon spiral into a confrontation that would change his life and the lives of others in his town. James didn't know what to expect when the cop first approached him. He had been in enough tense situations during his time in the military to recognize when someone was on edge. The officer, Officer Thompson, was standing by his squad car, his eyes fixed on James from the moment he stepped onto the sidewalk. James felt an uneasy feeling rise in his chest, but he pushed it aside. After all, he was a war hero, a veteran who had served his country, someone who had earned respect. But this time, respect wasn't on the table. As James walked past the officer, Thompson stepped in front of him without warning. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" the officer demanded, his voice sharp and aggressive. James froze, confused. He had done nothing wrong. He wasn't causing any trouble. He simply wanted to get home, like any other person. "I'm just heading home, officer," James said calmly, his voice steady despite the confusion that began to set in. "That's not what I asked," Officer Thompson snapped, taking a step closer. "You're not from around here, are you? I've seen you before. What are you doing in my neighborhood?" James was taken aback. The comment, laced with subtle suspicion, was one he had heard too many times. It was the kind of question that implied he didn't belong here, a question often rooted in assumptions based on his skin color. "I've lived here for years," James replied, trying to keep his voice even. "I'm just a neighbor. What's the issue?" But instead of backing down, Officer Thompson's demeanor grew more confrontational. "You don't belong here. I don't like seeing people like you around this area," the officer muttered, loud enough for James to hear. The words hit James like a slap in the face. Before he could even process what had just been said, the officer lunged at him, shoving him roughly against the squad car. The shock was instantaneous. James didn't even have time to react before the officer's fist collided with his face, sending him crashing to the ground. Everything happened so fast. James, a man who had fought on foreign soil for his country, was now being treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood, a neighborhood he had served, fought, and bled for. The moment that was meant to be just another day turned into a traumatic, violent event that would set off a chain reaction no one could have predicted. But what happened next, what James' son did in retaliation for his father's attack, would spark something much larger than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just a moment of revenge, it was a statement, and it would go viral, capturing the attention of the entire nation. What happens when one man's actions finally push a father's son to take matters into his own hands? Could revenge lead to justice? And what happens when the world is watching? This isn't just about one man's fight against police brutality. It's about how one act of violence can change everything, and how one son's response could spark a movement that demands change. James Wilson had always been a man of quiet strength. He wasn't the type to boast about his past, but his service to his country spoke volumes. A decorated Army veteran, James had served in combat zones, seen the horrors of war, and fought for freedom. He returned from the battlefield with scars, some visible, some hidden, but none more profound than the sense of duty that had been instilled in him during those years. He was a proud man, a father, and a man who believed in justice above all else. After his military service, James returned to his hometown, hoping to finally live a peaceful life. He settled down in a small neighborhood, a place that felt like home. The streets weren't as lively as they used to be, but It was quiet, almost too quiet. The neighborhood had changed over the years. There were new faces now, and many of them were unfamiliar to James. But he made his peace with that, focused on his family, and tried to stay out of trouble. James was a proud father to his son, Malik, a young man in his early 20s who looked up to him with admiration and respect. Malik had grown up hearing stories of his father's service, of the bravery and sacrifice that came with being in the military. But there was also a darker side to James's experiences, one that Malik was just beginning to understand. James had tried to shield his son from the harsh realities of the world, but the truth had a way of catching up with them. Malik had witnessed firsthand the racism that his father had faced, both during his time in the military and in civilian life. It wasn't just the small, everyday slights. Malik had seen the more blatant forms of discrimination too. He had heard the whispers behind closed doors, and had watched as his father, despite everything he'd done for this country, was treated with suspicion and disdain simply because of the color of his skin. James never spoke much about the racism he had encountered. He had been taught to endure, to carry himself with dignity, and to let his actions speak louder than words. But it didn't escape Malik's notice that his father had always been the one to take the high road, to avoid conflict, even when he was being unjustly treated. It wasn't easy for Malik to watch, and as he grew older, he began to ask questions. Why did his father stay quiet? Why didn't he stand up to the people who treated him like he didn't belong? Despite Malik's questions, James remained silent. He wanted to shield his son from the ugliness of the world, to protect him from the deep-seated prejudices that ran through the community. But Malik was no fool. He could see the way people looked at his father, and it hurt him. Malik admired his father's strength, but he also felt a growing sense of anger about the injustice they both faced. The Wilson family lived a simple life, but it was a life that had been marred by the reality of systemic racism. While James worked to provide for his family, there were days when he couldn't ignore the stares, the snide comments, the sense that he was constantly being judged. He had been a soldier, fighting for the very freedom that seemed so out of reach for him and his family in their everyday lives. And while the world may have given him a medal for his service, it had never truly accepted him as an equal. Then came the day that would change everything. James had just left the local store, a place he had visited countless times. It was a warm afternoon, and he was looking forward to getting home to his wife and relaxing. But as he walked down the familiar street, something in the air felt different. It wasn't just the oppressive heat of the summer sun. It was something else, a subtle tension that seemed to hang in the air. That's when he saw Officer Thompson, a cop he had encountered before, but never in such a direct way. Thompson had a reputation in the neighborhood for being quick to judge, and even quicker to make assumptions. James had tried to avoid any interaction with him, but today that wasn't possible. Thompson's eyes locked onto him from across the street, and before James knew it, the officer was standing right in front of him, blocking his path. James didn't know what to expect. He had dealt with difficult people before, both in the military and in civilian life. But what happened next would be unlike anything he had ever faced. As the officer began to question him, making accusations about his presence in the neighborhood, James tried to remain calm. But the officer's tone quickly turned condescending, then outright hostile. And when James tried to assert his rights, when he tried to explain that he belonged here just as much as anyone else, Officer Thompson's response was violent. The punch was unexpected. It came out of nowhere, and before James could even react, he was on the ground, his body racked with pain. But what hurt more than the physical blow was the realization that, despite all his years of service, Despite all he had done for his country, he was still seen as a threat because of the color of his skin. James tried to get up, but his body betrayed him. He felt dizzy, his vision blurred. He was a soldier, but right now, he was just a man, vulnerable and alone. As he struggled to regain his composure, his thoughts turned to Malik. What would his son think of all this? How would Malik react to seeing his father treated like this, especially after everything they had both endured? The moment was a turning point for James. He had always tried to keep the peace, to take the high road, but now he was unsure how to move forward. His body may have been bruised, but it was his spirit that had been most wounded. And little did he know, this moment would not only ignite a fire inside of him, but also in his son, Malik. Malik would soon find out about the incident, and when he did, everything would change. He had always admired his father's restraint, but now he couldn't help but wonder if his father's quiet endurance had done more harm than good. Would he sit back and accept the injustice done to his father, or would he take matters into his own hands? It was a day like any other when everything changed. James had walked the same path hundreds of times before. The warm sun kissed his face as he walked toward home, eager to relax after his errands. But this time, something was different. The world seemed to press in on him as he neared the intersection where Officer Thompson was standing. The officer's gaze met his, and the tension in the air immediately thickened. "Hey! What are you doing here?" Officer Thompson's voice was sharp, as though he had been waiting for this moment. James, startled, paused for a moment. He knew this officer, knew him enough to recognize that this wasn't a casual question. This was an accusation in disguise. He sighed, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just walking home," James replied, his hands instinctively clenching at his sides. He wasn't sure why, but something about this encounter felt off. Thompson's gaze hardened. "I don't recognize you around here. You don't belong in this neighborhood. What's a guy like you doing walking these streets?" James felt the blood rush to his face. He had heard this kind of questioning before. People who assumed he didn't belong simply because of the color of his skin. The sting of the words was sharp, but he refused to let them break his composure. "I've lived here for years. I've been in this neighborhood long before you were a cop." Thompson took a step closer, his posture becoming more aggressive. "You're not welcome here. I don't like seeing people like you walking around my neighborhood. This is my beat. You better show some respect." The word stung like an open wound. But James had learned to stay calm in the face of provocation. His military training had taught him how to handle confrontations, how to stay composed under pressure. But this was different. This wasn't a soldier on the battlefield. It was a man being treated like an intruder in his own home. The injustice of it gnawed at him, and for a brief moment, James thought about walking away, ignoring the cop's taunts. But he couldn't do that. He had faced too much in his life to let someone bully him now. "Look," James said, his voice firm but calm, "I'm not here to cause trouble. I've got no reason to bother anyone. I'm just heading home. Let me go." But instead of stepping aside, Thompson stepped forward, blocking James's path. His eyes flashed with contempt. "I said you're not welcome here, and I don't think you should be walking around in my neighborhood without a reason." James's heartbeat quickened. He could feel the rising tension, the unmistakable sense that this was no longer a simple conversation. It had become something far darker, and before he could react, Officer Thompson moved in quickly, shoving James roughly against his squad car. The force of the push caught James off guard, and he stumbled for a moment, barely able to catch his balance. The next moment was a blur. James had no time to react before Thompson's fist landed squarely on his face. The impact was sharp and brutal, sending a jolt of pain through his body. The force of the punch knocked James to the ground, his vision spinning. He could feel the scrape of asphalt against his cheek as he hit the ground, but it was the sting in his chest, the sting of being treated like a criminal, even after everything he had done for this country, that hurt the most. For a moment, James lay there, stunned, the world spinning around him. He could hear the distant murmurs of people nearby, some too afraid to intervene, others too shocked to do anything. He tried to push himself up, but his body was slower than usual, the weight of his years catching up with him. His head throbbed, blood trickling from the cut on his lip where Thompson's punch had landed. "Get up, you!" Thompson growled, his voice dripping with anger. "You don't deserve to walk freely around here." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had served this country. He had fought for freedom. He had been willing to give his life for people like Officer Thompson. Yet here he was, on the ground, humiliated, and treated like an outsider in his own home. The injustice was more painful than the physical blow. As James tried to gather himself, his thoughts turned to Malik. He thought about his son, the boy he had raised with love and care, the boy who had seen his father endure these injustices and always take the high road. What would Malik think of this? How would he feel if he knew his father, a man who had fought for the country, was being punched by a racist cop in the streets? James slowly got to his feet, his vision blurry but his resolve strong. He wasn't going to take this quietly. But before he could say another word, Thompson had already turned away, clearly satisfied with what he had done. James stood there for a moment longer, his fists clenched, his chest heaving with anger and frustration. He knew what he had to do. As James limped home, the pain in his face seemed to fade, replaced by a seething anger. He knew he couldn't let this go, but there was more at stake here than just his own dignity. This wasn't just about a cop and a veteran. It was about his son, Malik, and the future they would have to face in this unjust world. Malik, who had always looked up to his father, was about to find out what had happened, and when he did, everything would change. Malik's love for his father, his admiration, would turn into something far more dangerous: revenge. Great. Now, let's proceed with Section 4, Climax. Part 1. In this section, we'll delve into the son's emotional reaction after learning about the attack on his father. He struggles with his anger, but ultimately, his deep sense of justice drives him to take action. We'll build up the tension and set the stage for the viral revenge to come. He had been at work, far from home, when his phone buzzed. It was a text from his mom. And at first, he thought it was just a casual update. But when he read the message, the words hit him like a punch to the gut. "Your father's been hurt. The officer who did it, he punched him. You need to come home." The message was brief, but it was enough. Malik's heart raced as he quickly excused himself from work, grabbing his jacket and rushing out the door. His mind was racing, his thoughts all over the place. His father, the man who had raised him with strength and dignity, had been attacked, and not by some stranger, but by a cop who should have been sworn to protect people like his father, not harm them. The injustice of it hit Malik hard. His father had served his country, sacrificed his body and mind for it, and now, in his own neighborhood, he was being treated like this. Malik had always admired his father's ability to stay calm, to take the high road no matter what was thrown his way. But this was different. This wasn't something he could just let slide. As Malik drove home, the images from the text replayed in his mind. His father was a man who had seen the worst of the world and still managed to keep his head held high. But today, he was treated like a criminal. He had been knocked to the ground, his dignity stripped away by someone who thought he could get away with it because of his badge. By the time Malik reached home, the rage inside him had built to a boiling point. He walked into the house to find his father sitting on the couch, his face bruised and swollen, but his spirit unbroken. James looked up at his son as he entered, his eyes weary but filled with a quiet strength. "I'm okay, son," he said softly, his voice tired. "It's nothing." Malik stood still for a moment, taking in the sight of his father, the man who had taught him to never back down, to fight for what was right. But now, his father had been beaten down by someone who was supposed to protect him. "Dad," Malik said, his voice shaky with emotion, "you shouldn't have to deal with this. No one should treat you like that." James gave him a tired smile. "It's just the way things are, Malik. We've been dealing with this our whole lives. It's just another bump in the road." But Malik couldn't just accept it. He couldn't sit by and watch his father, his hero, be treated like that. This wasn't just about his father's pain anymore. This was about standing up, about doing something to show that this kind of behavior wouldn't be tolerated. "What if I could do something about it?" Malik asked suddenly. His words shocked James, who turned to him with a questioning look. "What do you mean?" James asked, his voice calm but wary. Malik's fists clenched at his sides. He couldn't just sit back and wait for the system to fix this. The system had failed his father, and it had failed so many others like him. What if I exposed it? What if people knew what happened? Really happened? Maybe then something would change. James's expression darkened. "Son, you don't want to get caught up in this. This isn't your fight. It's dangerous." But Malik wasn't listening. The anger inside him was too strong now. He couldn't let it go. He had seen his father take the high road his whole life, but he also knew that sometimes that wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to fight back, show the world what was really happening. "I'm not going to let this go, Dad. I'm going to make sure people know what that cop did." James stared at his son, his heart heavy with concern. He knew Malik's anger came from a good place, but he also knew that revenge often came with consequences. The consequences of speaking out, of pushing back, could be far-reaching. "I can handle this," James said quietly, trying to calm his son's emotions. "I'll take care of it." But Malik was already walking to his bedroom, his mind made up. He was no longer thinking about the consequences. He was thinking about one thing: justice. For his father, for all the people who had suffered silently for far too long. The next few hours were a blur for Malik. He didn't sleep. Instead, he planned. He searched for the best way to make the story known, to expose what Officer Thompson had done. He knew he had to act quickly before the incident was swept under the rug, as so many had been before. Malik decided to go public with it. He didn't want to keep this quiet. He would film a video, a message directly to the people in his town, to the world. He would expose the attack for what it was, an act of racial violence by someone who had sworn to serve and protect. As he set up his phone and prepared to speak, a sense of determination washed over him. This wasn't just about retaliation. This was about something bigger. This was about shining a light on an ugly truth that had been hidden for too long. The video he posted that night quickly spread through social media. Malik didn't just speak about the incident. He spoke with passion. He spoke about his father's military service, about the way his family had been treated all their lives, about how people in power continued to abuse it. He spoke directly to the cop, to Officer Thompson, and to everyone who had ever turned a blind eye to racism. The message was clear. Enough was enough. Malik's video went viral. It caught the attention of not just his town, but people across the country. The video of his father's assault, combined with his impassioned plea for justice, struck a chord. People rallied behind Malik, flooding social media with messages of support and solidarity. The hashtag, Justice for James Wilson, began trending within hours. But with that viral moment came something else: the fear of the unknown. Malik didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if the cop would be held accountable or if his actions would have unintended consequence for his family. What he did know was that he couldn't go back. He couldn't pretend this injustice didn't happen. The fire of injustice had been lit in Malik's heart, and he wasn't about to let it go out. He had started a fire that would demand change, and it was spreading faster than he could have imagined. It was a blur of notifications, messages, and headlines as the footage of Officer Thompson's unprovoked attack on James Wilson, combined with Malik's impassioned call for justice, spread like wildfire. Social media was flooded with hashtags and comments, some praising Malik for speaking out, while others questioned his methods. But one thing was certain: the entire nation was paying attention now. The video hit every major platform: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. People were shocked, angered, and deeply moved by the footage of a respected veteran being assaulted by a cop in the streets. The raw emotion in Malik's voice, his frustration, his pride in his father, and his demand for accountability resonated with so many people, particularly those who had experienced similar racial injustices. The hashtag, Justice for James Wilson, quickly began trending, with thousands of people rallying behind Malik and his father. But with the attention came the backlash. People who had watched the video were split. Some believed Malik was justified in his actions. Finally, someone was speaking out against the kind of police brutality that had plagued so many communities for years. Others, however, took issue with Malik's decision to publicly confront Officer Thompson. They labeled him a vigilante, someone who was only escalating an already dangerous situation. The debate quickly turned into a national conversation about race, justice, and the role of law enforcement in society. As the video circulated, more and more people began to share their own stories of police brutality and systemic racism. Victims who had been silenced for so long suddenly found their voices. They saw in James and Malik's story a reflection of their own struggles, their own fears. The floodgates opened and the conversation shifted from just one incident to an entire movement. The police department, now under intense public scrutiny, had no choice but to respond. Within hours of the video going viral, the department issued a statement expressing their concern about the incident. But the damage had already been done. The community was furious, and the pressure mounted. It wasn't just the punch that had people angry. It was the idea that someone in a position of power could treat a citizen with such cruelty and disregard. People wanted answers. People wanted accountability. Malik watched from his phone as the story continued to unfold. The local news stations picked up the story, and soon major news outlets were running segments on the incident. Officers and community leaders were interviewed, but the question on everyone's mind was the same. Why had Officer Thompson reacted the way he did? Why had he escalated the situation with a punch instead of de-escalating it? As Malik read through the comments and news reports, a wave of conflicting emotions hit him. On one hand, he was relieved that the truth was finally coming to light. His father's dignity had been restored in a way he never thought possible. But, on the other hand, he knew there was no going back. The world was watching, and the consequences of his actions were only just beginning to unfold. The next morning, the police department announced that Officer Thompson had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. While this was a step in the right direction, it was clear to Malik that the department was simply trying to quell the growing storm. The question remained, would Thompson face real consequences for his actions? Would this just be another case of a corrupt system protecting one of its own? Malik was determined to keep pushing for justice. The fight was far from over. He knew that exposing the truth was just the beginning. The battle for real accountability, real justice, was something that would take time and effort. But he was ready for it. At the same time, Malik couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride for his father. James had always carried himself with dignity, even in the face of injustice. Now, because of Malik's actions, the world knew what had happened. People saw the truth. And maybe, just maybe, the change they had all been waiting for was finally within reach. The viral video continued to stir up conversation in every corner of the country. National leaders and activists took to social media to show their support, and marches were organized in James's honor. Malik had started a movement, one that was bigger than just his father's case. It was about justice for everyone who had been wronged by the system. Meanwhile, Officer Thompson was in the eye of the storm. His colleagues were silent, and the public outcry grew louder each day. He was a man whose actions had sparked a nationwide conversation, and now he was facing the consequences. News reports surfaced about his past disciplinary actions, shedding light on his history of aggressive behavior. It was clear that Officer Thompson had not just acted in a moment of frustration. His actions were part of a larger pattern of racial bias and misconduct. The police department could no longer ignore the pressure. They knew they had to take action, not just for James, but for the integrity of the department. They officially announced that they would be conducting a full investigation into Thompson's actions. Whether it would lead to a full dismissal or other consequences was still uncertain, but the public had made their voices heard. Malik's viral video had forced the system to confront its flaws, and people across the country were demanding that change happen now. As Malik sat at home, surrounded by his father's love and support, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of justice in the air. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. But for the first time, he felt like they were on the right path. Malik had stood up for his father, and in doing so, he had given others the courage to stand up for themselves, too. The fire that had been sparked in Malik's heart was now burning brightly, and the world was watching. The viral moment had ignited a movement, and the journey toward justice was only just beginning. The fallout from Malik's viral video was swift and undeniable. Officer Thompson, once a symbol of authority, now faced the full force of public outrage. The police department had no choice but to place him on leave, and soon after, an internal investigation was launched into his history of misconduct. It was a step in the right direction, but for Malik, it wasn't enough. He wasn't satisfied with just seeing Thompson temporarily suspended. He wanted real change. As the investigation into Thompson's actions unfolded, the national conversation about police brutality and systemic racism only grew louder. Protests erupted in cities across the country with people calling for justice. Not just for James, but for everyone who had suffered from the same kind of unjust treatment. Malik had started something bigger than himself, a movement. James, though still recovering from the physical attack, felt a deep sense of pride for his son. Malik had done what he could never do, stand up to the injustice expose the truth, and demand accountability. It was a moment of redemption for James, who had spent years quietly enduring the systemic racism that had colored his life. Now, because of Malik's bravery, people were finally listening. While Officer Thompson's fate was still uncertain, the damage to his career was irreversible. The public pressure had made it clear that such behavior would no longer be tolerated. The police department faced renewed scrutiny, and reforms were promised in the wake of the incident. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. For Malik, the journey wasn't over. He knew this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. His viral video had sparked a conversation, but real change would take time. He stood beside his father, knowing they had taken the first step in demanding justice for everyone who had been wronged by the system. As Malik looked around, he realized something important. His father's story wasn't just about one incident. It was about a lifetime of struggle, a lifetime of enduring injustice. But now, the world had taken notice, and for the first time, Malik felt like the fight for justice was no longer just his family's battle. It was everyone's. Malik's story is one of courage, standing up when it feels like the world is against you. But it's also a story that asks us all, what would we do if we were in his shoes? Would we speak up against injustice? Or stay silent, hoping it doesn't affect us? Malik didn't wait for change to happen. He made it happen. So I ask you, what are you willing to stand up for? When you see injustice, will you speak out or will you turn away? The fight for fairness isn't over. It's a journey that requires all of us to be brave, just like Malik. If you believe in justice and accountability, don't stay silent. Share your thoughts below. Tell us what you would have done in Malik's position. Your voice matters. If this story resonated with you, make sure to share and subscribe. Let's keep this conversation going and continue to push for change together. Remember, the fight for justice starts with us.